The rapid pace of our modern society has been focused on progress and development using resources for profit to build a higher standard of life. This path has led to the invention of miraculous technology, but for many it has produced a feeling of disconnection. The imbalance caused by this has produced a resurgence of interest in spirituality, a holistic approach to health and natural conservation. For those races who are biologically and historically closest to tribal cultures, the disconnection is often felt the deepest. In response to this, many cultures have begun to revive their traditional customs, language, and beliefs. For one of these cultures, it is now becoming a source of pride to live in both worlds, honoring the best of the past and present, the American Indian.
You know, we could spend some time talking about who an Indian is, but in a nutshell, there are different aspects to who an Indian person is. There's a political aspect, there's a cultural aspect, and there's the biological component of who an Indian is. And it's that biological component that's race-based or sometimes referred to as ethnicity or ethnic background.
Indian people are unique in that you have to prove that you're Indian. You can't just say, I'm Indian. You have to provide the documentation back to some government role. Then the government will say, yes, indeed, you are Indian.
Michigan's Indians today are located throughout the state. They live in urban areas, rural settings, or on reservations. Michigan Indians may belong to state historic tribes or to federally recognized tribes. Federal recognition allows for greater protection of sovereignty and access to resources, such as attaining additional land that may be placed in trust and participation in federal health, housing, and educational programs.
Indian tribes are more than just another minority, because other minorities do not have the political status that we referred to earlier that's recognized under federal Indian law. So tribes have, and Indian people have, a legal right to be distinct, to be separate, to provide for themselves, to have their own tribal self-government, and also to preserve their culture.
The United States Constitution acknowledges the sovereignty of Indian tribes, and several lawsuits over the years have clarified their position. Even though federal treaties were signed mainly to obtain land for development of the United States, there have been extreme fluctuations in federal Indian policy from the discovery period to the present.
These extreme fluctuations have been very disruptive to Indian tribes, their communities, their economies, their social fabric, families, and individuals. There was basically the dispossession of Indian people from their land. They were forced onto reservations, and so they lost their connection to Mother Earth, their spiritual connection, cultural connections. And as Indian people were ignored by the federal government and forced to go to boarding schools, forced to give up their native language, forced to move into cities, forced to leave home to find adequate employment because their ways of livelihood had been disrupted. All of those things have had profound impact on Indian people and Indian communities. But beyond that, there's another phenomena that we quite often forget about, and that is that virgin soil epidemics, much like HIV today, came to the New World with the immigrants, with the colonists, with the settlers. And these were diseases for which native people did not have immunities. And so this whole series of different diseases devastated the Indian population across the United States several times.
A state policy that has impacted many Indian families since the 1950s was the practice of social services to take Indian children from their parents if the government felt they weren't being raised acceptably. The children were then adopted out to non-native families. Arlene Naganash's half-sister was taken and grew up not knowing her family and heritage until just recently.
She thought that she had been thrown away. That was the feeling that she grew up with. She didn't know that all this time her family was looking for her. Didn't know what happened to her. And she came to visit. And when she came to visit, my aunt one of my aunts told her that my grandfather, who was not her grandfather, cried when they came to pick her up because he wanted to keep her. Now that might be different now in the Indian Child Welfare Act because the tribe would step in and say, that's our child. But that's one of the reasons for that Indian Child Welfare Act, because the Indian children were taken away and put someplace and the people couldn't find them. But now, you know, if you have relatives who are willing to take them, you know, they can be placed and the tribe can decide, is that a suitable home for that child? So Indian people have a mistrust of public welfare, of government in general, because they've lost a lot and they don't know whether they can trust or not. How are you going to be treated?
Before discovery, the vast area around the Great Lakes was inhabited by Algonquin-speaking people called Anishinaabeg, meaning the people. They differentiated themselves in various regions by different customs. The customs became associated with names that others called them. When the Europeans arrived, they classified and labeled the tribes, often corrupting their names in the translation. Ojibwe became Chippewa. Odawa became Ottawa. In order to develop the eastern states, artificial boundaries were set up to establish treaty areas. These were sectioned off and sold to settlers. This was the main way the U.S. government paid for its war debts and maintained its army. The federal government signed several treaties to give the Michigan Territory the land necessary to draw a population and apply for statehood in 1837. The Indian tribes that were party to those signings were given no land because the Indian Removal Act was in effect. That law required Indian tribes in developing areas east of the Mississippi to be relocated to what is now Oklahoma. During that time, the law was not actively enforced in Michigan, but the confusion of the era caused many tribal members to leave Michigan.
There are Odawas that are related to us down in Oklahoma and down in Kansas because they got in a boat, which was their regular way of life, in their canoe, and went to Chicago and got picked up and moved off to Indian country. We have people up in Canada and Wikwemakan who left the Cross Village area because they did not want to be removed. Those who could passed and became French. And they did that to survive. Same way with our language. My grandmother was in the boarding schools and she was punished for speaking her language. But it's coming back because there are enough people who remember and who still have that memory and are working very hard to preserve that. Because a sense of who we are. You can say things in Indian that you can't really translate into English. They lose their meaning when they're translated.
If learning the language or any of these other developments that are going on in tribal community works to create self-worth in individuals, in families, in the community, and if it contributes towards the creation of an identity of what that community is, who its families are, seems to me that those are significant reasons for not only learning the language, but preserving what we can of our culture and revitalizing our community.
Indian communities today are at different levels of economic growth and cultural revitalization. Because of this, differences in appearance, culture, and tradition may be apparent. Many Indians do not appear to have